I'm Katie Grady, and this is The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle, Chapter 13. The way was wide enough for all of them to walk abreast, but they went one by one. The Lady Amalthea walked in front, by her own choosing. Prince Lear, Schmendrick, and Molly Grew following had only her hair for lantern, but she herself had no light before her at all. Yet she went on as easily as though she had been this way before. Where they truly were, they never knew. The cold wind seemed real, as did the cold reek that rode it, and the darkness let them pass far more grudgingly than had the clock. The path itself was enough of a fact to bruise feet, and to be partly choked in places by real stones and real earth that had crumbled down the sides of the cave. But its course was the impossible way of a dream, pitched and skewed, rounding on itself, now dropping almost sheer, now seeming to rise a little, now working out and slowly down, and now wandering back to take them perhaps once again below the great hall where old King Haggard must still be raging over a toppled clock and a shivered skull. Witch work, surely, Schmendrick thought, and nothing made by a witch is real at the last. Then he added, "But this must be the last. It will all be real enough if this is not the last." As they stumbled along, he hurriedly told Prince Lear the tale of their adventures, beginning with his own strange history and stranger doom, recounting the ruin of the midnight carnival and his flight with the unicorn, and continuing through their meeting with Molly Grew, the journey to Hagsgate, and Drin's story of the double curse on the town and the tower. Here he halted, for beyond lay the night of the Red Bull, a night that ended for good or ill with magic, and with a naked girl who struggled in her body like a cow in quicksand. He hoped that the prince would be more interested in learning of his heroic birth than in the origins of the Lady Amalthea. Prince Lear marveled suspiciously, which is an awkward thing to manage. "I have known for a very long time that the king is not my father," he said, "but I tried hard to be his son all the same. I'm the enemy of any who plot against him, and it would take more than a crone's gibbering to make me work his downfall. As for the other, I think there are no unicorns any more, and I know that King Haggard has never seen one. How could any man who had looked upon a unicorn even once, let alone thousands with every tide, possibly be as sad as King Haggard is? Why, if I had only seen her once, and never again." Now he himself paused in some confusion, for he also felt that the talk was going on to some sorrow from which it could never be called back. Molly's neck and shoulders were listening intently, but if the Lady Amalthea could hear what the two men were saying, she gave no sign. "Yet the king has a joy hidden somewhere about his life," Schmendrick pointed out. "Have you never seen a trace of it, truly? Never seen its track in his eyes? I have. Think for a moment, Prince Lear." The prince was silent, and they wound further into the foul dark. They could not always tell whether they were climbing or descending, nor sometimes if the passage were bending once again until the gnarly nearness of stone at their shoulders suddenly became the bleak rake of a wall against their faces. There was not the smallest sound of the Red Bull, or any glimmer of the wicked light, but when Schmendrick touched his damp face, the smell of the bull came off on his fingers. Prince Lear said, "Sometimes, when he has been on the tower, there is something in his face. Not a light, exactly, but a clearness. I remember, I was little, and he never looked like that when he looked at me, or at anything else. And I had a dream." He was walking very slowly now, scuffling his feet. "I used to have a dream," he said, "the same dream over and over, about standing at my window in the middle of the night and seeing the bull, seeing the Red Bull." He did not finish. "Seeing the bull driving unicorns into the sea," Schmendrick said. "It was no dream. Haggard has them all now, drifting in and out on the tides for his delight. All but one. The magician drew a deep breath. That one is the Lady Amalthea. Yes, Prince Lear answered him. Yes, I know. Schmendrick stared at him. What do you mean you know? He demanded angrily. How could you possibly know that Lady Amalthea is a unicorn? She can't have told you because she doesn't remember it herself. Since you took her fancy, she has thought only of being a mortal woman. He knew quite well that the truth was the other way around, but it made no difference to him just then. How do you know? He asked again. Prince Lear stopped walking and turned to face him. It was too dark for Schmendrick to see anything but the cool, milky shining where his wide eyes were. I did not know what she was until now, he said, but I knew the first time I saw her that she was something more than I could see. Unicorn, mermaid, lamia, sorceress, gorgon. No name you could give her would surprise me or frighten me. I love whom I love. That's a very nice statement, Schmendrick said, but when I change her back into her true self, so that she may do battle with the Red Bull and free her people, I love whom I love, Prince Lear repeated firmly. You have no power over anything that matters. Before the magician could reply, the Lady Amalthea was standing between them, though neither man had seen or heard her as she came back along the passageway. In the darkness, she gleamed and trembled like running water. She said, I will go no further. It was to the prince that she spoke, but it was Schmendrick who said, There is no choice. We can only go on. Molly Grew came nearer, one anxious eye and the pale start of a cheekbone. The magician said again, We can only go on. The Lady Amalthea would not look straight at him. He must not change me, she said to Prince Lear. Do not let him work his magic on me. The bull has no care for human beings. We may walk out past him and get away. It is a unicorn the bull wants. Tell him not to change me into a unicorn. Prince Lear twisted his fingers until they cracked. Schmendrick said, It is true. We might very well escape the Red Bull that way, even now, as we escaped before. But if we do, there will never be another chance. All the unicorns of the world will remain his prisoners forever, except one, and she will die. She will grow old and die. Everything dies, she said, still to Prince Lear. It is good that everything dies. I want to die when you die. Do not let him enchant me. Do not let him make me immortal. I am no unicorn, no magical creature. I am human, and I love you. He answered her, saying gently, I don't know much about enchantments, except how to break them. But I know that even the very greatest wizards are powerless against two who keep to each other, and this one is only poor Schmendrick after all. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of anything. Whatever you have been, you are mine now. I can hold you. She turned to look at the magician at last, and even through the darkness he could feel the terror in her eyes. No, she said. No, we are not strong enough. He will change me, and whatever happens after that, you and I will lose each other. I will not love you when I am a unicorn, and you will love me only because you cannot help it. I will be more beautiful than anything in the world and live forever. Schmendrick began to speak, but the sound of his voice made her cower like a candle flame. I will not have it. I will not have it so. She was looking back and forth from the prince to the magician, holding her voice together like the edges of a wound. She said, If there is left a single moment of love when he changes me, you will know it, for I will let the Red Bull drive me into the sea with the others. Then at least I will be near you. There's no need for all that. Schmendrick spoke lightly, making himself laugh. I doubt I could turn you back if you wished it. Nikos himself could never turn a human being into a unicorn, and you are truly human now. You can love and fear and forbid things to be what they are and overact. Let it end here, then. Let the quest end. Is the world any the worse for losing the unicorns, and would it be any better if they were running free again? One good woman more in the world is worth every single unicorn gone. Let it end. Marry the prince and live happily ever after. The passageway seemed to be growing lighter, and Schmendrick imagined the Red Bull stealing toward them, grotesquely cautious, setting his hooves down as primly as a heron. The thin glimmer of Molly Grew's cheekbone went out as she turned her face away. "Yes," said the Lady Amalthea, "that is my wish." But at the same moment, Prince Lear said, "No." The word escaped him as suddenly as a sneeze, emerging in a questioning squeak, the voice of a silly young man mortally embarrassed by a rich and terrible gift. "No," he repeated, and this time the word told in another voice, a king's voice, not haggard, but a king whose grief was not for what he did not have, but for what he could not give. "My lady," he said, "I am a hero. It is a trade, no more, like weaving or brewing, and like them it has its own tricks and knacks and small arts. There are ways of perceiving witches and of knowing poisoned streams. There are certain weak spots that all dragons have, and certain riddles that hooded strangers tend to set you. But the true secret of being a hero lies in knowing the order of things. The swineherd cannot already be wed to the princess when he embarks on his adventures, nor can the boy knock at the witch's door when she's away on vacation. The wicked uncle cannot be found out and foiled before he does something wicked. Things must happen when it is time for them to happen. Quests may not simply be abandoned. Prophecies may not be left to rot like unpicked fruit. Unicorns may go unrescued for a long time, but not forever. The happy ending cannot come in the middle of the story." The Lady Amalthea did not answer him. Schmendrick asked, "Why not? Who says so?" "Heroes," Prince Lear replied sadly. "Heroes know about order, about happy endings. Heroes know that some things are better than others. Carpenters know grains and shingles and straight lines." He put his hands out to the Lady Amalthea and took one step toward her. She did not draw back from him nor turn her face. Indeed, she lifted her head higher, and it was the prince who looked away. "You were the one who taught me," he said. "I never looked at you without seeing the sweetness of the way the world goes together, or without sorrow for its spoiling. I became a hero to serve you and all that is like you. Also to find some way of starting a conversation." But the Lady Amalthea spoke no word to him. Pale as lime, the brightness was rising in the cavern. They could see one another clearly now, each gone tallowy and strange with fear. Even the beauty of the Lady Amalthea drained away under that dull, hungry light. She looked more mortal than any of the other three. "The bull is coming," Prince Lear said. He turned and set off down the passageway, taking the bold, eager strides of a hero. The Lady Amalthea followed him, walking as lightly and proudly as princesses are taught to try to walk. Molly Grew stayed close to the magician, taking his hand as she had been used to touch the unicorn when she was lonely. He smiled down at her, looking quite pleased with himself. Molly said, "Let her stay the way she is. Let her be." "Tell that to Lear," he replied cheerfully. "Was it I who said that order is all? Was it I who said that she must challenge the Red Bull because it will be more proper and precise that way? I have no concern for regulated rescues and official happy endings. That's Lear." "But you made him do it," she said. You know that all he wants in the world is to have her give up her quest and stay with him, and she would have done it, but you reminded him that he is a hero, and now he has to do what heroes do. He loves her, and you tricked him." "I never," Schmendrick said. "Be quiet, he'll hear you." Molly felt herself growing lightheaded, silly with the nearness of the bull. The light and the smell had become a sticky sea in which she floundered like the unicorns, hopeless and eternal. The path was beginning to tilt downward, into the deepening light, and far ahead Prince Lear and the Lady Amalthea went marching along to disaster as calmly as candles burning down. Molly grew snickered. She went on. "I know why you did it, too. You can't become mortal yourself until you change her back again. Isn't that it? You don't care what happens to her or to the others, just as long as you become a real magician at last. Isn't that it? Well, you'll never be a real magician, even if you change the bull into a bullfrog, because it's still just a trick when you do it. You don't care about anything but magic, and what kind of a magician is that? Schmendrick, I don't feel good. I have to sit down." Schmendrick must have carried her for a time, because she was definitely not walking, and his green eyes were ringing in her head. "That's right. Nothing but magic matters to me. I would round up unicorns for Haggard myself if it would heighten my power by half a hair. It's true. I have no preferences and no loyalties. I have only magic." His voice was hard and sad. "Really?" she asked, rocking dreamily in her terror, watching the brightness flowing by. "That's awful." But she was very impressed. "Are you really like that?" "No," he said, then or later. "No, it's not true. How could I be like that and still have all these troubles?" Then he said, "Molly, you have to walk now. He's there. He's there." Molly saw the horns first. The light made her cover her face, but the pale horns struck bitterly through hands and eyelids to the back of her mind. She saw Prince Lear and the Lady Amalthea standing before the horns, while the fire flourished on the walls of the cavern and soared up into the roofless dark. Prince Lear had drawn his sword, but it blazed up in his hand, and he let it fall, and it broke like ice. The Red Bull stamped his foot, and everyone fell down. Schmendrick had thought to find the bull waiting in his lair or in some wide place with room enough to do battle, but he had come silently up the passageway to meet them, and now he stood across their sight, not only from one burning wall to the other, but somehow in the walls themselves and beyond them, bending away forever. Yet he was no mirage, but the Red Bull, still steaming and snuffling, shaking his blind head. His jaws champed over his breath with a terrible wallowing sound. Now is the time, whether I work ruin or great good. This is the end of it." The magician rose slowly to his feet, ignoring the bull, listening only to his cupped self as to a seashell. But no power stirred or spoke in him. He could hear nothing but the far, thin howling of emptiness against his ear, as old King Haggard must have heard it waking and sleeping, and never another sound. "It will not come to me. Nikos was wrong. I am what I seem." The Lady Amalthea had stepped back a pace from the bull, but no more, and she was regarding him quietly as he pawed with his front feet and snorted great, rumbling, rainy blasts out of his vast nostrils. He seemed puzzled about her, and almost foolish. He did not roar. The Lady Amalthea stood in his freezing light with her head tipped back to see all of him. Without turning her head, she put her hand out to find Prince Lear's hand. Good. Good, there is nothing I can do, and I'm glad of it. The bull will let her by, and she will go away with Lear. It is as right as anything. I am only sorry about the unicorns." The prince had not yet noticed her offered hand, but in a moment he would turn and see and touch her for the first time. He will never know what she has given him, but neither will she. The Red Bull lowered his head and charged. He came without warning, with no sound but the rip of his hooves, and if he had chosen, he could have crushed all four of them in that one silent onslaught. But he let them scatter before him and flatten themselves into the wrinkled walls, and he went by without harming them, though he might easily have horned them out of their shallow shelters like so many periwinkles. Supple as fire, he turned where there was no room to turn, and met them again, his muzzle almost touching the ground, his neck swelling like a wave. It was then that he roared. They fled, and he followed, not as swiftly as he had charged, but quickly enough to keep each one alone, friendless in the wild dark. The ground tore under their feet, and they cried out, but they could not even hear themselves. Every bellow of the Red Bull brought great slides of stones and earth shuddering down on them, and still they scrambled along like broken insects, and still he came after them. Through his mad blaring they heard another sound, the deep whine of the castle itself as it strained at its roots, drumming like a flag in the wind of his wrath. And very faintly there drifted up the passageway the smell of the sea. He knows. He knows. I fooled him once that way, but not again. Woman or unicorn, he will hunt her into the sea this time, as he was bidden, and no magic of mine will turn him from it. Haggard has won. So the magician thought as he ran, all hope gone for the first time in his long, strange life. The way widened suddenly, and they emerged into a kind of grotto that could only have been the bull's den. The stench of his sleeping hung so thick and old here that it had a loathly sweetness about it, and the cave brooded gullet red, as though his light had rubbed off on the walls and crusted in the cracks and crevices. Beyond lay the tunnel again, and the dim gleam of breaking water. The Lady Amalthea fell as irrevocably as a flower breaks. Schmendrick leaped to one side, wheeling to drag Molly Grew with him. They brought up hard against a split slab of rock, and there they crouched together as the Red Bull raged by without turning. But he came to a halt between one stride and the next, and the sudden stillness, broken only by the bull's breathing and the distant grinding of the sea, would have been absurd but for the cause of it. She lay on her side, with one leg bent beneath her. She moved slowly, but she made no sound. Prince Lear stood between her body and the bull, weaponless, but with his hands up as though they still held a sword and shield. Once more in that endless night, the prince said, "No." He looked very foolish, and he was about to be trampled flat. The Red Bull could not see him and would kill him without ever knowing that he had been in the way. Wonder and love and great sorrow shook Schmendrick the magician then, and came together inside him and filled him until he felt himself brimming and flowing with something that was none of these. He did not believe it, but it came to him anyway, as it had touched him twice before and left him more barren than he had been. This time, there was too much of it for him to hold. It spilled through his skin, sprang from his fingers and toes, welled up equally in his eyes and his hair and the hollows of his shoulders. There was too much to hold, too much ever to use, and still he found himself weeping with the pain of his impossible greed. He thought, or said, or sang, "I did not know that I was so empty, to be so full." The Lady Amalthea lay where she had fallen, though now she was trying to rise, and Prince Lear still guarded her, raising his naked hands against the enormous shape that loomed over him. The tip of the prince's tongue stuck out of one corner of his mouth, making him look as serious as a child taking something apart. Long years later, when Schmendrick's name had become a greater name than Nikos, and worse than a Fritz surrendered at the sound of it, he was never able to work the smallest magic without seeing Prince Lear before him, his eyes squinted up because of the brightness and his tongue sticking out. The Red Bull stamped again, and Prince Lear fell on his face and got up bleeding. The Red Bull's rumble began, and the blind, bloated head started down, lowering like one half of the scales of doom. Lear's valiant heart hung between the pale horns, as good as dripping from their tips, himself as good as smashed and scattered, and his mouth buckled a little, but he never moved. The sound of the bull grew louder as the horns went down. Then Schmendrick stepped into the open and said a few words. They were short words, undistinguished either by melody or harshness, and Schmendrick himself could not hear them for the Red Bull's dreadful bawling. But he knew what they meant, and he knew exactly how to say them, and he knew that he could say them again when he wanted to, in the same way or in a different way. Now he spoke them gently and with joy, and as he did so, he felt his immortality fall from him like armor or like a shroud. At the first word of the spell, the Lady Amalthea gave a thin, bitter cry. She reached out to Prince Lear, but he had his back to her, protecting her, and he did not hear. Molly grew, heartsick, caught at Schmendrick's arm, but the magician spoke on. Even when the wonder blossomed where she had been, sea-white, as boundlessly beautiful as the bull was mighty, still the Lady Amalthea clung to herself for a moment more. She was no longer there, and yet her face hovered like a breath in the cold, reeky light. It would have been better if Prince Lear had not turned until she was gone, but he turned. He saw the unicorn, and she shone in him as in a glass, but it was to the other that he called, to the castaway, to the Lady Amalthea. His voice was the end of her. She vanished when he cried her name as though he had crowed for day. Things happened both swiftly and slowly as they do in dreams, where it is really the same thing. The unicorn stood very still, looking at them all out of lost, elsewhere eyes. She seemed even more beautiful than Schmendrick remembered, for no one can keep a unicorn in his head for long. And yet she was not as she had been, no more than he was. Molly Grew started toward her, speaking softly and foolishly, but the unicorn gave no sign that she knew her. The marvelous horn remained dull as rain. With a roar that set the walls of his lair belling out and cracking like circus canvas, the Red Bull charged for the second time. The unicorn fled across the cave and into darkness. Prince Lear, in turning, had stepped a little to one side, and before he could wheel back again, the bull's plunging pursuit smashed him down, stunned, with his mouth open. Molly would have gone to him, but Schmendrick took hold of her and dragged her along after the bull and the unicorn. Neither beast was in sight, but the tunnel still thundered from their desperate passage. Dazed and bewildered, Molly stumbled beside the fierce stranger who would neither let her fall nor slacken her pace. Over her head and all around, she could feel the castle groaning, creaking in the rock like a loosening tooth. The witch's rhyme jangled in her memory over and over. Yet none but one of Hagsgate town may bring the castle swirling down. Suddenly it was sand slowing their feet, and the smell of the sea, cold as the other smell, but so good, so friendly that they both stopped running and laughed out loud. Above them on the cliff, King Haggard's castle splayed up toward a gray-green morning sky splashed with thin, milky clouds. Molly was sure that the king himself must be watching from one of the tremulous towers, but she could not see him. A few stars still fluttered in the heavy blue sky over the water. The tide was out, and the bald beach had the gray, wet gleam of a stripped shellfish, but far down the strand the sea was bending like a bow, and Molly knew that the ebb had ended. The unicorn and the Red Bull stood, facing each other at the arch of the bow, and the unicorn's back was to the sea. The bull moved in slowly, not charging, but pressing her almost gently toward the water, never touching her. She did not resist him. Her horn was dark, and her head was down, and the bull was as much her master as he had been on the plain of Hagsgate before she became the Lady Amalthea. It might have been that same hopeless dawn, except for the sea. Yet she was not altogether beaten. She backed away until one hind foot actually stepped into the water. At that, she sprang through the sullen smolder of the Red Bull and ran away along the beach, so swift and light that the wind of her passing blew her footprints off the sand. The bull went after her. "Do something," a hoarse voice said to Schmendrick, as Molly had said it long ago. Prince Lear stood behind him, his face bloody and his eyes mad. He looked like King Haggard. "Do something," he said. "You have power. You changed her into a unicorn. Now do something to save her. I will kill you if you don't." He showed the magician his hands. "I cannot," Schmendrick answered him quietly. "Not all the magic in the world can help her now. If she will not fight him, she must go into the sea with the others. Neither magic nor murder will help her." Molly heard small waves slapping on the sand. The tide was beginning to turn. She saw no unicorns tumbling in the water, though she looked for them, willing them to be there. What if it was too late? What if they drifted out on the last ebb tide, out to the deepest sea where no ships go, because of the kraken and the sea drake, and because of the floating jungles of wrack that tangle and drown even those? She will never find them then. Would she stay with me? "Then what is magic for?" Prince Lear demanded wildly. "What use is wizardry if it cannot save a unicorn?" He gripped the magician's shoulder hard to keep from falling. Schmendrick did not turn his head. With a touch of sad mockery in his voice, he said, "That's what heroes are for." They could not see the unicorn for the hugeness of the bull, but suddenly she doubled on her track and came flying up the beach toward them. Blind and patient as the sea, the Red Bull followed her, his hoofs gouging great ditches in the damp sand. Smoke and fire, spray and storm, they came on together, neither one gaining, and Prince Lear gave a soft grunt of understanding. "Yes, of course," he said. "That is exactly what heroes are for. Wizards make no difference, so they say that nothing does. But heroes are meant to die for unicorns." He let go of Schmendrick's shoulder, smiling to himself. "There is a basic fallacy in your reasoning," Schmendrick began indignantly, but the prince never heard what it was. The unicorn flashed by them, her breath streaming blue-white and her head carried too high, and Prince Lear stepped into the path of the Red Bull. For a moment, he disappeared entirely, like a feather in a flame. The bull ran over him and left him lying on the ground. One side of his face cuddled too hard into the sand, and one leg kicked the air 3 times before it stopped. He fell without a cry, and Schmendrick and Molly alike were stricken as silent as he. But the unicorn turned. The Red Bull halted when she did, and wheeled to put her once more between himself and the sea. He began his mincing, dancing advance again, but he might have been courting a bird for all the attention the unicorn paid him. She stood motionless, staring at the twisted body of Prince Lear. The tide was grumbling in hard now, and the beach was already a slice narrower. Whitecaps and skippers' daughters spilled up into the sprawling dawn, but Molly Grew still saw no other unicorn but her own. Over the castle, the sky was scarlet, and on the highest tower, King Haggard stood up as clear and black as a winter tree. Molly could see the straight scar of his mouth and his nails darkening as he gripped the parapet. But the castle cannot fall now. Only Lear could have made it fall. Suddenly, the unicorn screamed. It was not at all like the challenging bell with which she had first met the Red Bull. It was an ugly, squawking wail of sorrow and loss and rage such as no immortal creature ever gave. The castle quaked, and King Haggard shrank back with one arm across his face. The Red Bull hesitated, shuffling in the sand, lowing doubtfully. The unicorn cried out again and reared up like a scimitar. The sweet sweep of her body made Molly close her eyes, but she opened them again in time to see the unicorn leap at the Red Bull, and the Red Bull swerve out of her way. The unicorn's horn was light again, burning and shivering like a butterfly. Again she charged, and again the bull gave ground, heavy with perplexity, but still quick as a fish. His own horns were the color and likeness of lightning, and the slightest swing of his head made her stagger, but he retreated and retreated, backing steadily down the beach as she had done. She lunged after him, driving to kill, but she could not reach him. She might have been stabbing at a shadow or at a memory. So the Red Bull fell back without giving battle until she had stalked him to the water's edge. There he made his stand, with the surf swirling about his hooves and the sand rushing away under them. He would neither fight nor fly, and she knew now that she could never destroy him. Still she set herself for another charge, while he muttered wonderingly in his throat. For Molly Grew, the world hung motionless in that glass moment. As though she were standing on a higher tower than King Haggard's, she looked down on a pale paring of land where a toy man and woman stared with their knitted eyes at a clay bull and a tiny ivory unicorn. Abandoned playthings. There was another doll, too, half buried, and a sand-castle with a stick king propped up in one tilted turret. The tide would take it all in a moment, and nothing would be left but the flaccid birds of the beach hopping in circles. Then Schmendrick shook her back to his side, saying, "Molly." Far out to sea, the combers were coming in, the long, heavy rollers curling over white across their green hearts, tearing themselves to smoke on the sandbars and the slimy rocks, rasping up the beach with a sound like fire. The birds flew up in yelling clumps, their strange outrage lost in the cry of the waves like pins. And in the whiteness, of the whiteness, flowering in the tattered water, their bodies arching with the streaked marbled hollows of the waves, their manes and tails and the fragile beards of the males burning in the sunlight, their eyes as dark and jeweled as the deep sea, and the shining of the horns. The seashell shining of the horns. The horns came riding in like rainbow masts of silver ships. But they would not come to land while the bull was there. They rolled in the shallows, swirling together as madly as frightened fish when the nets are being hauled up, no longer with the sea, but losing it. Hundreds were borne in with each swell and hurled against the ones already struggling to keep from being shoved ashore, and they in turn struck out desperately, rearing and stumbling, stretching their long cloudy necks far back. The unicorn lowered her head one last time and hurled herself at the Red Bull. If he had either been true flesh or a windy ghost, the blow would have burst him like rotten fruit. But he turned away, unnoticing, and walked slowly into the sea. The unicorns in the water floundered wildly to let him by, stamping and slashing the surf into a roiling mist which their horns turned rainbow. But on the beach and atop the cliff and up and down through all of Haggard's kingdom, the land sighed when his weight had passed from it. He strode out a long way before he began to swim. The hugest waves broke no higher than his hocks, and the timid tide ran away from him. But when at last he let himself sink onto the flood, then a great surge of the sea stood up behind him, a green and black swell as deep and smooth and hard as the wind. It gathered in silence, folding from one horizon to the other, until for a moment it actually hid the Red Bull's humped shoulders and sloping back. Schmendrick lifted the dead prince, and he and Molly ran until the cliff face stopped them. The wave fell like a cloudburst of chains. Then the unicorns came out of the sea. Molly never saw them clearly. They were a light leaping toward her and a cry that dazzled her eyes. She was wise enough to know that no mortal was ever meant to see all the unicorns in the world, and she tried to find her own unicorn and only look at her. But there were too many of them, and they were too beautiful. Blind as the bull, she moved to meet them, holding out her arms. The unicorns would surely have run her down as the Red Bull had trampled Prince Lear, for they were mad with freedom. But Schmendrick spoke, and they streamed to the right and left of Molly and Lear and himself, some even springing over them as the sea shatters on a rock and then comes whirling together again. All around Molly there flowed and flowered a light as impossible as snow set afire, while thousands of cloven hooves sang by like cymbals. She stood very still, neither weeping nor laughing, for her joy was too great for her body to understand. "Look up," Schmendrick said. "The castle is falling." She turned and saw that the towers were melting as the unicorns sprang up the cliff and flowed around them, exactly as though they had been made out of sand and the sea were sliding in. The castle came down in great cold chunks that turned thin and waxen as they swirled in the air until they disappeared. It crumbled and vanished without a sound, and it left no ruins, either on land or in the memories of the two who watched it fall. A minute later they could not remember where it had stood or how it had looked. But King Haggard, who was quite real, fell down through the wreckage of his disenchanted castle like a knife dropped through clouds. Molly heard him laugh once, as though he had expected it. Very little ever surprised King Haggard.